One quiet night, an unspoken tension between us surfaced, setting off a chain of events that would change everything. People say change is tough, but I wasn't prepared for how unsettling it could be. Moving in with Mom and my new stepdad felt like venturing into unknown territory. I'd barely gotten to know him before she decided he was the one, and suddenly we were all living under the same roof. I couldn't put my finger on what made me uneasy, but there was a tension in the air, thick and heavy, almost like you could slice right through it. The house itself was charming, an old two-story place with creaky floors and rooms that seemed to echo back whatever was said in them. The walls were covered in family photos, most of them from his past life, with friends I didn't recognize and places I'd never been. Mom fit right in, smiling and beaming as though everything was perfect. But for me, it was all unfamiliar, like stepping into someone else's memory. As the days went on, things settled into a rhythm. He and I didn't talk much at first. It was mostly polite nods in passing or small talk like at the dinner table. He had a quiet confidence, a way of commanding attention without trying, which made me feel out of place in my own home. Mom worked long hours, leaving me alone with him more often than I'd expected, but I chalked it up to part of the getting to know you phase. One night I was sprawled out in the living room trying to catch up on homework. When he walked in, he paused for a moment before sitting down across from me, picking up the remote and flipping through the channels. Silence hung between us, thick and uneasy, as the screen flickered from one show to the next. Eventually he settled on some old movie, leaning back and stretching his arm across the back of the couch, his gaze drifting over to me. "You seem like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulder," he said, his tone light but probing. I shrugged, not really knowing what to say. "Just school stuff." I guess he nodded, his eyes narrowing a little as though he was sizing me up. I remember those days, seems like a lifetime ago. There was a strange look in his eyes, something contemplative that made me feel like he was seeing through me. I couldn't place it, but I found myself shifting in my seat, trying to shrug off the discomfort growing in my stomach. He turned his attention back to the screen, and I tried to do the same with my homework, but his presence seemed to fill the entire room. A few days later, Mom suggested that he and I should do something father-son-like. I'd laughed it off, but she was serious, insisting that we spend more time together. She wanted us to bond, to find some common ground. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but I could see she had her heart set on it. So reluctantly, I agreed, and he seemed oddly eager. He decided to take me fishing, which was the last thing I'd expected. The lake was quiet and secluded, a good hour's drive from home. It was one of those still, cloudless days where everything felt eerily calm. I watched as he expertly cast his line, his movements steady and assured, while I struggled to follow his instructions without tangling mine. We didn't talk much at first, just listened to the quiet lapping of water against the boat. But then, out of nowhere, he started asking questions, not the typical small talk, but more personal things I hadn't really thought about sharing with him. "So what's it like being back with your mom full-time?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. "It's different, I guess," I said, hesitating. "I haven't really lived with her for a while." He nodded thoughtfully. "It's hard, isn't it, adjusting to new things? New people?" "Yeah, a little," I admitted, surprised by his insight. There was a pause and he glanced over at me, his expression unreadable. "But you'll get used to it. Give it time." For the rest of the trip he kept the conversation light, telling stories about his own teenage years, the trouble he'd gotten into, the lessons he'd learned. It was strange hearing these things from him, seeing this other side for a moment. I felt like we were actually bonding, like maybe this arrangement could work out after all. As the weeks went by, he and I continued to spend time together. Sometimes he'd help me with my homework, offering advice that was surprisingly useful. Other times we'd sit in silence watching whatever happened to be on TV. It was an unspoken arrangement. These shared moments, but there was an intensity in his gaze that I couldn't ignore. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I found myself drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. Then one rainy Saturday, everything seemed to shift. Mom had gone out to run errands, leaving the two of us alone in the house. I was in my room, lost in a book, when I heard a knock on my door. Before I could respond, he poked his head in, his usual easygoing smile, replaced by something else, something that made my stomach tighten. "Mind if I come in?" he asked, his tone casual but carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. "You sure?" I said, sitting up a little straighter. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and sat down on the edge of my bed. I wasn't sure what to make of it. We'd spent time together before, sure, but never like this. Alone in my room, with the door closed, he looked at me for a long moment. His expression, unreadable. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about this whole family thing." He began, his voice low. "It's a big adjustment for all of us, but especially for you." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was something unsettling in the way he was looking at me, something that made my skin prickle. It can't be easy moving in with a new family, new rules. He continued, his gaze never leaving mine. "But you're handling it well. I just wanted you to know that." "Thanks," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I could feel my pulse quickening, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what was happening, why he was here in my room telling me these things. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's nice to have someone to talk to, you know." There was a pause, a silence that stretched on just a second too long. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the air between us thick with something I didn't understand. He reached out, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You're a good kid," he said softly, his fingers lingering a little too long. "You've got a good head on your shoulders." I tried to smile, to act normal, but the intensity in his gaze made it impossible. I didn't know what to say, how to react. It was like the room had shrunk, closing in around us, and I felt trapped, unable to look away. Finally he stood up, breaking the spell. "I'll let you get back to your book," he said, his tone lighter. But before he left, he paused, glancing back at me with a look that sent a shiver down my spine. As soon as he was gone, I let out a breath. I hadn't realized I was holding my mind spinning. There was something strange about that moment, something I couldn't quite put into words. But deep down, I knew things were changing, that whatever was happening between us was only just beginning. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur, but that encounter with him in my room lingered in the back of my mind, impossible to shake. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that he was just being nice, trying to connect, but something about it didn't sit right. There was an intensity in his eyes, a strange energy in the air, like we were both balancing on the edge of something neither of us understood. The following week I did my best to avoid him. I stuck to my room, kept to myself, and tried not to be around the house much when he was home. It wasn't hard to pull off considering his work schedule, but that only meant that when we did see each other it felt more charged, more loaded with something unspoken. One evening Mom had gone out for a work event, leaving just the two of us. I told myself I'd spend the night in my room, maybe study or play video games to distract myself. But I kept hearing his footsteps around the house, the sound pulling me out of my focus, and every time I heard him near, a part of me tensed. Eventually I wandered downstairs to grab a snack, hoping to slip back up unnoticed. But the second I reached the kitchen, there he was, leaning against the counter, his eyes lighting up when he saw me hungry. He asked, his voice casual, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made it hard to breathe, just grabbing something quick. I muttered, heading to the fridge, but I could feel his gaze following me, a weight that made it impossible to focus. He didn't move, just watched as I grabbed an apple and closed the fridge door. I was about to turn and head back upstairs when he spoke again, his voice low. "You know, you don't have to hide up there all the time. You can hang out down here if you want." There was an invitation in his tone, a warmth that made me pause. I glanced back at him, catching his eye for a split second, and saw a flicker of something there, something I couldn't quite place. He seemed to realize it too, because he quickly looked away, shifting his weight and clearing his throat. I hesitated, unsure whether to stay or go, but then he nodded toward the couch in the living room, the corners of his mouth lifting in a small, almost hesitant smile. "Come on, you can keep me company for a bit." Against my better judgment, I found myself walking over and settling on the couch, my heart pounding as he joined me. We sat in silence for a while, neither of us saying much, just watching the faint glow of the TV as some random show played in the background. But despite the silence, the air between us felt charged, like we were both waiting for something to happen. After a while, he broke the silence, his voice soft but probing. "You're pretty quiet. I guess I'm still trying to figure you out." I let out a nervous laugh, trying to shrug it off. "I guess I'm just not used to all this." He nodded, his gaze drifting over me in a way that made my skin prickle. "It's a big change for both of us. I didn't expect it to be this complicated." "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Same here." There was another silence, and I could feel him watching me, studying me. I shifted uncomfortably, my pulse quickening as the tension in the room grew thicker. Then he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "You don't have to be so tense around me, you know. I'm not a stranger." I forced a smile, hoping to mask the nerves that were threatening to spill over. "I know, it's just different. That's all." He held my gaze for a moment longer before finally leaning back, letting out a sigh. "You're right. This whole situation is a lot to get used to." For the next hour we talked about school, friends, anything that didn't involve the strange tension that lingered between us. And for a while it felt almost normal, like we were just two people trying to get to know each other. But every now and then I'd catch his eyes on me, lingering a second too long, a look that sent shivers down my spine. Then, just as I was starting to feel a little more relaxed, he reached over, placing a hand on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, my heart racing as his fingers rested there, warm and steady. "You know, it's nice having someone around. This house has felt empty for a long time," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "Yeah, I guess it's nice having people around too." His hand lingered for a moment longer before he finally pulled back, leaving me feeling oddly exposed. I could feel my cheeks burning, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts, none of which made any sense. "I should probably head to bed," I said, standing up a little too quickly, desperate to escape the tension that seemed to be closing in around me. He watched me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Of course, don't let me keep you." I forced a tight smile, nodding before practically fleeing upstairs, my heart pounding. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. There was something there, something I couldn't explain, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The next few days were tense, filled with more of those loaded glances, those moments that seemed to stretch on a second too long. I started feeling like I was walking on eggshells, trying to navigate this strange new dynamic without really understanding what was happening. Mom was out for the night attending some work event, and I was alone with him again. I tried to stay in my room to avoid whatever was building between us, but the silence was suffocating, pressing down on me until I couldn't take it anymore. I wandered downstairs hoping he'd gone to bed, but instead I found him sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in hand. He looked up when he saw me, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Couldn't sleep. I hesitated, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu as I walked over and sat down next to him. Yeah, something like that. He offered me the wine glass and I took it without thinking, grateful for something to distract myself with. We sat in silence, the weight of the past few days pressing down on us, thickening the air around us until it was almost unbearable. After a while he turned to me, his expression serious. I know things have been strange between us. I can feel it too. I tensed, my heart pounding as I forced myself to look at him. Yeah. I guess I don't really know what to make of it. He nodded slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. Me neither. But maybe we don't need to figure it out. Maybe we can just let things be. There was a vulnerability in his voice, something I hadn't seen before, and it made my stomach twist. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. All I knew was that the tension between us was suffocating, pulling us closer in a way I couldn't understand. And then, before I could stop myself, I found myself leaning in, closing the small distance between us. Our faces were inches apart, our breaths mingling as we hovered there, caught in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. But before anything could happen, he pulled back, his eyes wide, his expression a mix of shock and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I'm sorry, I whispered, my face burning with embarrassment. He shook his head, a faint smile crossing his lips. Don't be. It's okay. We sat there in silence, the air between us thick with everything that had gone unsaid, and as I looked at him, a part of me knew that this was only the beginning, that whatever was happening between us was far from over. The days that followed, our last conversation, felt surreal. Every time I saw him, my heart would race, my mind spinning with everything that had been left unspoken. We hadn't talked about that moment on the couch, about the closeness, the tension, the way we'd almost crossed a line. But it was there, lingering between us, a silent understanding that neither of us seemed willing to break. I found myself replaying it in my mind, dissecting every look, every word, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down I knew I hadn't. There was something real between us, something that simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to break free. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, to push it aside, it refused to go away. One evening, after an especially tense dinner where Mom had been blissfully unaware of the tension radiating between us, I decided to clear my head with a long, hot shower. I hoped the steam and solitude would help wash away the confusion, the lingering feelings that I couldn't quite shake. I needed to feel normal, to remind myself that whatever was happening was just a phase, something that would pass if I could just ignore it long enough. I closed the bathroom door behind me, letting out a long sigh as I turned on the water. The room quickly filled with steam, the warmth enveloping me as I stepped under the spray, letting the heat relax my tense muscles. For a moment, I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the water drown out the thoughts that had been circling in my mind for days. But even as I stood there trying to find some semblance of peace, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was ridiculous. I knew I'd locked the door behind me, and no one else was home except him, probably downstairs watching TV or doing whatever it was he did in his spare time. But the sensation persisted, a prickle on the back of my neck that made me open my eyes, glancing around the small, flogged-up bathroom. I was just being paranoid. It was normal considering everything that had happened, the strange intensity that had built up between us over the past few weeks. But as I turned off the shower and reached for my towel, I heard a faint knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze the towel halfway to my body. As I stared at the door. "You." "Yeah." There was a pause, and then his voice came through, muffled by the door. "Hey, I thought I heard the water running, wanted to make sure everything was okay." I swallowed, my pulse racing. "Yeah, just taking a shower." There was another pause, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he asked, "Mind if I come in?" I blinked, staring at the door, my mind racing. My first instinct was to say no, to tell him to give me some privacy, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself standing there. The towel clutched tightly around me, my heart pounding as I whispered, "Sure, yeah, come in." The door opened slowly and he stepped inside, his gaze meeting mine through the steam. He was quiet, his expression unreadable as he closed the door behind him, locking us in the small, fog-filled space for a moment. Neither of us said anything, the silence stretching on as he took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and something else, something I didn't want to name. I opened my mouth to say something to break the tension that hung heavy between us, but he beat me to it. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it." I swallowed, gripping the towel tighter as I tried to find my voice. I didn't know what to say. He took another step closer, the steam swirling around us as he closed the distance between us. "You don't have to say anything. Sometimes words just get in the way." I felt my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as he reached out, his hand resting lightly on my arm. The touch was gentle, barely there, but it sent a jolt through me, my skin tingling where his fingers lingered. I wanted to pull away to tell him this was too much, but my body wouldn't obey. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. Before I knew what was happening, he leaned in, his face inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. I could feel his hesitation, the way he hovered just a moment too long, as though giving me a chance to back away, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't move. I couldn't. And then slowly, almost hesitantly, he closed the gap between us, his lips brushing against mine in a soft, tentative kiss. My mind went blank, my body frozen as the kiss deepened, his hand sliding up to cup the side of my face. It was gentle, almost hesitant, like he was afraid of crossing some invisible line. But I could feel the intensity building, a tension that had been simmering between us for weeks, finally breaking free. I felt myself responding, my hands finding their way to his shoulders, gripping him as though he were the only thing keeping me grounded. The kiss grew more urgent, a quiet desperation driving us as we pressed closer, the steam enveloping us in a haze of warmth and intimacy. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his gaze searching as though looking for some sign that this was okay, that I wanted this as much as he did. I met his eyes, my own breath coming in shallow gasps, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all he needed. He leaned in, his lips, clammy, nung mine with fierce tenderness, hands wrapping around my waist, pulling me into a depthless embrace. Our bodies merged, warmth radiating, hearts pounding in unison. The kiss deepened, a vortex of sensations, sweeping me away, breathless, my mind reeled, lost in the intoxicating rush. Time froze as we stood, entwined, suspended in a moment both surreal and destined. The world outside dissolved, leaving only our tangled forms weighed down by the unspoken truth of our irresistible connection. Finally, he pulled back his forehead, resting against mine. As we caught our breath, the silence between us filled with 1,000 unspoken words. I could feel his hand still on my waist, his grip firm but gentle, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. I started my voice barely a whisper, but he placed a finger to my lips, silencing me with a small, almost wistful smile. "Don't," he murmured, his voice soft but filled with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "We don't have to explain this. Not now." I nodded, unable to find the words to express the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Instead, I simply leaned into him, letting the warmth of his embrace wash over me, grounding me in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. As the water dripped down my skin, the steam thickening around us, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. A quiet understanding that whatever this was, it was ours. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity, a certainty that no matter what happened next, I wasn't alone in this. We stayed like that for a while, locked in a quiet embrace, letting the weight of the moment wash over us. And as I looked up at him, meeting his gaze through the haze of steam, I felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet certainty that whatever came next, we would face it together. And as we stepped back from each other, I knew this wasn't the end. In the days after that night in the bathroom, everything felt heightened, like every sound was louder, every touch more vivid, every glance heavier with meaning. I found myself replaying the moments over and over in my mind, the memories clinging to me like shadows too intense to shake off. I tried to act normal around him to keep things from becoming obvious to Mom, but it was like trying to walk a tightrope over a canyon. One wrong move, one careless word, and everything would come crashing down. The tension wasn't just between us anymore. It was everywhere, an unspoken thing that colored every interaction, every shared meal, every passing glance in the hallway. I could feel it in the way he'd pause whenever he walked by my room, the way his gaze would linger, just a little too long when we were in the same room together, even if Mom was there. She didn't seem to notice, lost in her own world, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface one evening. Mom had a last-minute work call that kept her out late, leaving just the two of us alone again. I could feel the tension building from the moment she walked out the door, the silence between us thickening as we sat in the living room pretending to watch a movie. But my mind was miles away, tangled up in thoughts of that night in the bathroom, the feel of his hands on my skin, the way his eyes had looked into mine, like he could see right through me. As the credits rolled, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You want to go for a drive?" He asked, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made my pulse quicken. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and followed him outside. The air was cool, a faint breeze rustling through the trees as he climbed into the car. The drive was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound as we wound through empty streets, the city lights casting a soft glow over everything. After a while, he pulled over by a small park, the kind of place that was deserted at night. Its swings and benches empty, the playground silent. He killed the engine and leaned back, his gaze drifting out the window, lost in thought. I waited, my heart pounding, not knowing what to expect. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes dark and intense, a hint of something I couldn't quite place flickering behind them. "I don't know what to do about this," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "About us." I looked away, my throat tightening as I tried to find the right words. "I don't either," I admitted, the weight of the confession settling over me. He let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair as he stared out the windshield. "It's not supposed to be like this, You know that, right? I nodded, my chest tight as I fought to keep my emotions in check. I know, but I can't help how I feel. There was a long silence, the air between us thick with everything we couldn't say. He reached over, his hand resting on mine, his touch sending a jolt through me. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment everything else faded away, leaving only the two of us caught in a moment that felt as fragile as glass. "Whatever happens," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "just know that this was real. All of it." I nodded, my heart pounding as his words sank in their weight, settling over me like a blanket. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. All I knew was that in that moment I felt seen in a way I hadn't before, like he understood me in a way no one else ever could. The drive was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The silence between us no longer tense, but filled with a quiet understanding. When we got home, we went our separate ways without another word, each of us retreating to our rooms, the weight of what had been left unsaid hanging in the air. Over the next few days, we settled into a new rhythm, an unspoken agreement to keep things under wraps, to act normal around Mom, and pretend that nothing had changed. But every time our paths crossed, I could feel the pull between us, a magnetic force that seemed to draw us closer, no matter how hard we tried to resist. One night after Mom had gone to bed, I found myself wandering downstairs, unable to sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the darkened TV screen, lost in thought, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart skipping a beat as I saw him standing in the doorway, his eyes meeting mine with that same unreadable intensity. He walked over, settling down beside me, the silence stretching between us. As we sat there in the dark, I could feel his presence, the warmth of him so close, and for a moment I wanted nothing more than to close the distance between us, to lose myself in the comfort of his embrace. But I knew it couldn't last. Whatever this was, it was temporary, a fleeting moment in time that would eventually slip through our fingers. And as much as it hurt to admit, I knew we couldn't keep going like this. He seemed to sense it too, because he turned to me, his expression softening. "We have to stop," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet resignation that made my chest ache before it gets any harder. I nodded, my throat tightening as I fought to keep my composure. I know. We sat there in silence, both of us grappling with the weight of our decision, the unspoken understanding that this was the end. And as I looked at him, my heart heavy with everything I couldn't say, I knew that this was a moment I would carry with me for the rest of my life, a memory etched into my heart, a bittersweet reminder of a connection that could never be. Finally, he stood up, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the quiet of the night. And as I sat there alone, the reality of what had happened settling over me, I felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet acceptance that while this chapter of my life was ending, it had left an indelible mark on me, shaping me in ways I couldn't yet understand. In the days that followed, things slowly returned to normal, the tension that had once filled the air dissipating as we settled back into our routine. Mom remained blissfully unaware, her life untouched by the undercurrent that had once defined our interactions, and I found myself grateful for her obliviousness, for the fragile normalcy it provided. But every now and then I'd catch his eye across the room, a fleeting glance that held a world of unspoken words, a silent acknowledgement of everything we'd shared and everything we'd lost. And in those moments, I'd feel a pang of longing, a quiet ache for something that could never be. Time passed, life moved on, and eventually the memories faded, becoming a part of me woven into the fabric of my past. And though we never spoke of it again, though we buried our secret deep within us, I knew that it was something neither of us would ever forget, a bond that, though unspoken, would always be there hidden beneath the surface, a reminder of a time when, for a brief, fleeting moment, we had been something more